and welcome. I'm Barkha Dutt. You are watching the Mojo Story, our independent digital platform that does a deep dive into one big issue every day. On the program today, we look at Pakistan's sudden U-turn. It's come within the matter of a few hours on the issue of reopening trade ties with India. Now, remember on Wednesday, you had the Pakistan government basically announcing a lifting of the 2-year ban, starting with sugar and moving on to a timeline for cotton. The notification for this was approved by Prime Minister Imran Khan himself in his capacity as Commerce Minister. But then suddenly came the backlash and the U-turn. And a new statement from the Pakistan government says that till Article 370 is restored in Jammu and Kashmir, there can be no trade ties between the two countries. Now, since that is not going to happen, where does that leave bilateral trade? Where does that leave the larger relationship? We were just talking about possibly cricket, not just trade. And of course, we've had, out of the blue, but obviously born from a back channel that was working, a ceasefire agreement between the two nations. So how do we read these latest signs from Pakistan? We've got a very interesting panel of experts on the program, and let me introduce them one by one. You see on your screen General Atta Hasnain, who's former General Officer Commanding of the 15 Corps. Welcome to the program. We're also joined on the program by TCA Raghavan, who's a veteran diplomat and has served as High Commissioner to Pakistan. We're joined by Mosharraf Zaidi, one of the best-known journalists and commentators from Pakistan. And we're also joined by Nikita Singla, who's an associate director with The Brief, but whose area of research is in specific cross-border trade, in particular at the Atari-Wagah border in Punjab. So we have all the different perspectives, and I'd like to start with you, Mr. Raghavan, if I may, with all your experience of India-Pakistan relations. What happened here? We can't classically slot this as we normally do as a Pakistan army versus a Pakistan civilian spat, because many of the more peaceable statements have in fact come recently from Pakistan Army Chief General Bajwa. In your best estimate, and given that we know that Imran Khan, as Commerce Minister, signed on that summary that was presented before the government actually announced in Pakistan the lifting of that trade ban, what do you think happened here?
Well, thank you for inviting me to this discussion. In tactical terms, what happened is quite clear that Imran Khan first decided on a course of action around which he had not sufficiently built a consensus in the cabinet, and those differences were too serious to be bridged, so the decision had to be reversed. But in a long-term structural sense, I think what we are seeing is the consequence of the high level of rhetoric which the government of Pakistan has taken since August 2019, and the difficulties in climbing down from that very intensely pitched rhetorical position. So I would say this particular decision has to be seen in these two contexts.
So explain that a bit further. Do you think this is domestic politics and the fault lines in Pakistan are not the classic fault lines? I'll of course get a perspective from Mosharraf in a moment, but from the Indian perspective, usually what India's had to battle is that the army is not always on board, and when the army in Pakistan is not on board, peace moves don't go through. That's certainly what happened, for example, with what Nawaz Sharif attempted. Here, it's not clear that that's actually what's happened, Mr. Raghavan.
Well, that Pakistan has always, at least to my mind, is a simplistic view, and things are always much more complex. In the present case, yes, it is well known that there are very strong views on Jammu and Kashmir in Pakistan, but probably the Prime Minister did not sufficiently take into account the strength of those views, and possibly also did not take into account the erosion in his own position in the past few months. He has recently had to change his finance minister in the midst of a very difficult negotiation with international financial institutions. The economy is not doing well. That is the broader context for these different factions inside the Congress, inside the cabinet, to gain greater strength. And certainly there are members of the cabinet who cannot draw a distinction or have never drawn a distinction between substantive positions and rhetorical positions. So I think all these issues must have come up in that cabinet meeting, and the Prime Minister would have found that he has no option but to take the safe course of rescinding the earlier decision.
Okay, before I actually bring in General Hasnain, I want to get a view from Pakistan. And Mosharraf, we do try on this program and on this platform. We know that we see things very differently as Indians and Pakistanis, in particular on Jammu and Kashmir. But here, I think what we're really trying to understand is that very classic one step forward, two steps back phenomenon that plagues our two countries. And we saw the ceasefire. It emerged from some sort of back channel, and it emerged despite the scrapping of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir. We saw talk of trade and we saw talk of cricket, and we know Imran Khan, as Commerce Minister, signed off on that. You heard Ambassador Raghavan. What is your best estimate, Mosharraf, of what's going on here in your country?
Well, first, let me thank you, Barkha, for establishing this kind of a platform and doing the best you can in an ecosystem and an environment where this kind of conversation has been very difficult. And I think if these talks will move forward, platforms like this will increasingly be more and more important. So thank you for that. Second, I just want to thank you for bringing Raghavan to the show and giving us a chance to see him and speak to him again. He was a very, very effective and really excellent representative for his country while he was in Islamabad. And of course, we miss having not just him, but even Ajay, who was the most recent one. I think representation is important. I think, having said all this, I do agree, and this is a hard place to start on a platform like this, but I have to agree with Excellency Raghavan. There is, I think, too much of a binarizing of the discourse in Pakistan that tends to happen. I think we tend to do it domestically as well. I think people who don't like Imran Khan, attribute his prime ministership to the army. People who love Imran Khan attribute, it to divine intervention. And I think India is not unfamiliar with this kind of binarization of the discourse vis-a-vis Congress and the BJP, vis-a-vis Narendra Modi and previously as well. So I don't think that part is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. What I disagree with is how we're reading what Pakistan has been doing. So I think that if you really think about it hard, it's impossible to find anything that India has done to move toward a détente or normalization or peace, at least since roughly 2018. When we start making the list, the ledger on the Pakistani side is pretty heavy. It's got a lot of items on it. Now, of course, Indians will point to Pulwama, and Pulwama did happen. There's no denying that it happened, but there's still no proof. And frankly, I think if there was proof, certainly Western governments, even if the Indian government may have been hesitant, Western governments would have really gone to town on Pakistan. The 1267 placement, the FATF list, all of these conversations would have gone very differently if there was any kind of link between Pulwama and Pakistan, or certainly those organizations and the organization that Indians say was responsible. I don't want to make this debate about that, but I'm taking that off the table and presenting some evidence in that direction, because the rest of the list is actually Pakistan essentially bending over backwards to find a way to respond to and deal with the aggression and the muscularity of India's government, especially post-Modi 2. And especially, I think, the August 5th moves that India made vis-a-vis Kashmir. In response, I think there's a misreading by Raghavan and by many other friends in India who claim that Pakistan has climbed a rhetorical hill that it can't climb down from, because actually the Pakistani position, as it's stated and has been stated multiple times. So I don't think Imran Khan says anything new when he
Why
says,
did he approve it? I will respond to your comments on Pulwama right after a brief interjection, because I do want to, but I did want you to be able to say what you think without interrupting you, and then I will give you my perspective as an Indian. But on a different point, when you say that Pakistan, has had to do the heavy lifting, in your opinion, why do you think he agreed to begin with on the trade issue if he had to renege on it in 24 hours?
Because I think that we're the prime minister and the army chief and the leadership in Pakistan is trying to begin a conversation, and that conversation has begun. The conversation is, how does Pakistan deal with a sugar and a cotton yarn shortage? There are lobbies within Pakistan that want this deal to go through. There are lobbies in Pakistan that don't want it to go through, and neither of them are national security lobbies, right? Those are business lobbies. Some people make cotton products, textiles. Other people make sugar products, and there's a pretty robust non-binary way of seeing this debate. The fact that the debate has begun and the fact that we're having this conversation, I think, is a pretty substantial move forward.
Okay, now I just, I know, Mosharraf, if you and I start arguing about Pulwama, about Balakot, about Uri, about 2611, about Kashmir, we are not going to find a meeting point in this conversation. And since I did, without interrupting you, hear your perspective, I must share with you, and then I'll bring in General Hasnain, the Indian perspective. And the Indian perspective is, what is the purpose of trade and cricket and cotton and sugar if we can't even get Masood Azhar and the Jaish-e-Mohammed shut down? We can't even get Pakistan, even the liberals of Pakistan, to acknowledge that they function with impunity, as does Hafiz Saeed. So that is very much the Indian concern. There isn't an Indian whom you'll be able to convince that Pulwama was not the handiwork of Jaish-e-Mohammed. General Hasnain, given that wide gap between what I've just said and what Mosharraf has said, which is a microcosm of the gap between the Indian state and the Pakistani state, the Indian diplomat and the Pakistani diplomat, the Indian soldier and the Pakistani soldier. How do we make sense of the kind of flirtation we've seen on the trade issue and then the hasty sort of retreat from it?
Thank you, Barkha. Thank you, first of all, for having me on the show. It's great to be with this panel. And a big hello to Mosharraf, my friend from across. Always been a pleasure to have been in various discussions with him. Well, let me begin by saying that all that has happened in the last 2 months, perhaps, hasn't really surprised me in any way. Even the fact that there were peace proposals, ceasefire coming into place, and then this breakdown yesterday, all of a sudden, none of this seems to surprise me for the simple reason so much of it has been seen in the past. Now, if you go back to the 4 years from 2004 to 2008, when the backroom channels were very much alive and there was peace in the air at that time, I'm told by a number of senior military officials from Pakistan that none of the 9 corps commanders were ever with General Mosharraf. At that time, in fact, despite the fact that Mosharraf was president, he was the chief of the army staff. But today, everyone admits that actually there was no consensus. So consensus in Pakistan is not easy. People, I suppose, presume that the army being the driving force, everyone is going to stick on to that. It doesn't seem to be that. So there is a turnaround. I think there is a bit of a confusion taking place at the top leadership levels in Pakistan. I was encouraged by the fact that General Bajwa himself came on board to say, forget the past. And that seemed to be really egging on a great amount of positivity in this environment, something which has not happened for long. But I'm sure we will hear back from General Bajwa in the next 1 or 2 days. And this is not the final thing which has happened on the decisions on trade at the moment. But in Pakistan, finding this kind of consensus and then seeing as to who is in the driving seat. And that has been a problem with India, you know, that we really never understand as to who is in the driving seat in Pakistan, with whom one can do business.
Does it matter? Does it matter? Does it matter?
It matters, Barkha. It matters for continuity, if nothing else. It does matter for continuity. If you know the common saying, and generally which we always hear, that the ideal environment is when you have the army strongly, totally in power in Pakistan, and you have a nationalistic, strong government, central government in India. Then probably business can happen between the two countries. Peace can probably take place between the two countries. And that is the situation that we were imagining at the moment. But obviously, it's not that way in Pakistan. It seems to be a little different to what we are perceiving it to be. But having said that, I also perceive this is not the end of it. We are quite used to this. In the next few weeks, you're going to find the dynamics of this changing ever so often. And there will be some opinion by the army chief. It will go back and forth with the political entity, political community in Pakistan. That Article 370 can be restored, I think, is a fallacy in thinking. Pakistan should get it very clear. I'm sure someone like Mosharraf is very, very, his mature thinking is there to understand that this is a hugely emotive and sentimental issue in India too. And having taken this decision on the 5th of August 2019, I don't think there is any comebacks on this. So let's take this out of the complete discussion that we are having between the two countries.
So I just want to get Ambassador Raghavan on that. Given that, Mosharraf just argued that this is not a rhetorical corner that the Pakistan government has painted itself into, but having said in writing now or on record that till 370 is brought back, there can be no trade ties. And since we know as Indians that 370 isn't going to come back, how do both countries move from this corner? This stated position that Pakistan now has taken, how does Pakistan leave itself wiggle room should it want to going forward?
Well, in my view, stated positions have never acted as a significant barrier to things moving forward if both governments decide to move forward.
Yeah.
So I think there is no, in India-Pakistan relations, there's never been a great premium on consistency of position. So we may rave and rant about inconsistencies, but that is part of the terrain. Because if you go by stated positions, India and Pakistan should not have had any contacts in the past 7 years because your differences on so many issues are foundational. So I don't see the stated position having such a significant impact. But yes, I think this problem of how to build a consensus in Pakistan, and I quite take on board Mosharraf's point that many lobbies which may cloak themselves as being national security lobbies are in fact commercial lobbies, and they use national security issues as fronts to further their own agendas. I think all those factors are there. So there is a challenge for the government of Pakistan to build up a consensus around this issue. In my view, given the current setback, possibly things will not move so quickly on trade in the immediate future, but possibly other issues will be found on which there is some desire to move forward, because it is very clear.
For instance,
I think one big area where a consensus will be easier to build up on will be in the field of public health, especially given the pandemic situation in both countries. And there are other areas too, because what appears clear, insofar as one can make out without any insider information, that both governments have decided to inch forward. They may not have decided to do everything which is possible, but they have tried to do some doable things to reduce level of tensions. So given that situation, I would expect other fronts where some forward movement can be expected to emerge.
Yeah. And of course, it would be intriguing to understand what led to this intent to inch forward in both countries. And that's a mystery. I mean, we've all we've all been around long enough to know that this could not have happened without an active back channel. But what changed? What actually changed? And I will put that to Mosharraf and to the panel in just a moment. But I just want to bring in Nikita. Nikita spent a lot of time actually researching India-Pakistan trade, how it impacts people when the trade stops. Because it does impact people who live along the borders, Nikita. And in particular, I know you have focused on the families at the Atari-Wagah border. And you've spoken about how this actually impacts real people. This isn't just an sort of an abstraction here that we're talking about. You've looked at 9,354 families that have been hit by the trade halt in Atari. So go ahead with your findings, Nikita.
Thank you so much, Barkha, for having me, and it's a real honor to share to be in the company of such esteemed panelists. So I think when Pulwama happened, the first reaction everywhere was that it's hardly going to matter because India-Pakistan trade was too small for its suspension to have a significant impact on either of the national economies. But I think what we inadvertently overlook in this case is the impact on border economies, because international trade as a subject for policy making as well as research is generally focused on from a macro level. And we overlook the impact of border economies. And that is what took me to Amritsar when this happened, because I mean, just for context, before that, India-Pakistan trade was $2.6 billion, which is about 2% of Pakistan's trade and less than 1% for India. So the big question was, does it really matter? And when I went to Amritsar, I found the answer, because you realize that trade is much more than about traders. You know, it's about dhabawalas at the border area. It's about those tire puncher shops which solely rely on trucks coming in and out of Atari border.
Yeah.
It is about those laborers who are loading and unloading trucks at ICP Atari. And we found out that there were about 9,000 families, so 50,000 people in Amritsar who were solely dependent on this trade for their livelihood. And I remember, I think one of the stories that struck the most was I met a staff member at CWC Weybridge, the Central Warehousing Corporation, who said that his wedding was scheduled to happen on 18th of February, just 2 days after this news came in. And the bride's family called off the wedding, saying that the boy, he neither has a job now. I mean, he doesn't have a job now. So he wept. He said, I neither have a job now nor a family today. So, you know, there were stories of weddings being called off, of people pulling their kids out of private schools and putting them into government schools because they couldn't afford tuition fee. And it is also important to understand that though Pakistan, trade between Pakistan and India is heavily in favor of India, by which I mean it's India's exports to Pakistan that dominate this trade. But on Wagah Atari, it's the reverse. It's actually more than 80% of trade is imports coming in from Pakistan, and it's only less than 20% exports going from India. So when Indian government put 200% duty hike on the Pakistani imports, it basically struck all imports. Though we liked to believe that it didn't matter, I mean, it didn't impact the exports, but it actually impacted the imports so much that basically Wagah Atari trade came to a halt. And the main four commodities that were coming in were dry dates, cement, gypsum, and rock salt from Pakistan. Yeah. And all these four commodities, they were, I mean, there's a whole ecosystem around these commodities. There are 1,000 women in Amritsar whose sole dependence for livelihood is on hand cutting of dry dates, what we call chwara. So they earn about 200 rupees a day doing hand cutting of these. And it was not just the story on the Wagah Atari border, but I also traveled to Uri and Poonch when this happened, because I wanted to see what was the impact of suspension of cross-LOC trade. And we saw a very similar picture there, because there were about 25,000 families in Uri and Poonch. Again, a combination of laborers, CHAs, custom agents, drivers, truck drivers, who were again dependent just on this trade. And then you hear stories of people pulling their families, some patient in their family out of hospitals because they cannot afford the treatment anymore. People moving from pakka houses to kacha houses. So the list goes on and on.
But you know, I think it is very important to actually humanize what end up being very sort of academic, strategic affairs, policy wonk conversations. So thank you for that, Nikita. But Mosharraf, I think equally it can be sort of argued that the steep rise, for example, in Pakistan in the domestic price of sugar, it could be something as pragmatic as that maybe made a government step back and say, okay, maybe we need to take the chini from India. But I want you to speak to the larger point that you know, when you say that Pakistan has not pushed itself into a rhetorical corner, and Ambassador Raghavan and General Hasnain said that, look, 370 isn't coming back. Now, if that's the two positions of the two countries, what is possible within this space? What does that leave space for? And if it's not trade, do you accept that in a way there is this COVID vaccine linkage? Because even though Pakistan is going to get those vaccines from the WHO Gavi-run program, those vaccines are being produced in India, right?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, a lot of stuff has been produced in India, including, you know, my parents. So, you know, and I love them. So I think things being produced in India, you know, as being not just, you know, acceptable, but things that we can like. there's a long history of them, and it's not just people. It's culture. It's language. It's a whole bunch of things, including produce and goods and services. I don't think that there's really an issue there. Now, if I get, this is the difficult part of the conversation, Barkha. I guess if India wants to rub it in the face of Pakistan and not only have things India's way, but as it's having its way, kind of, essentially rubbing the face of, Pakistani policy in the ground. I think it may be possible to do that. India is increasingly economically stronger, and Pakistan economically, especially in the last 2.5 years, has really taken a step back. That economic weakness impinges the policy space for Pakistani policymakers. That much is clear. The question is, does India want to have its cake and eat it too, and then rub it in the face, the leftover cake in the face of the adversary here? And I think that there is a sentiment, as much as the democratic tradition in India has been something that many of us have celebrated. We've also seen a significant erosion of those traditions, and I think in terms of the BJP government and the RSS culture, that's exactly what the pitch is to the Indian people, that we will punish these people and
what are
way.
Pakistan's options? You may not like the Modi government, but what are Pakistan's options?
Of course, and lots of people in India don't like it either, and that's not a problem.
And a lot of people in India don't like the Imran Khan government, and this can carry on. So I think my question is, in that space that exists, what is possible?
So I think that I'm not sure that we're reading the demand for reversal as I think the way that I'm reading it. I think that
we can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We can hear you. Carry on. Yeah.
So the first thing that I think needs to happen is a release of the Kashmiri leaders, not just the Hurriyat, but the whole range of leaders that are that are sort of currently being held. That's number one. Number two, I think things like I know there's been some internet restoration, but that's patchy. So the ability of the Kashmiri people to speak and reach the world and access the internet, that kind of thing needs to be restored. I think maybe the most critical element of what is seen as a long-term game changer and a non-starter is the attempts at demographic change in Kashmir. Now, renewing Article 370 as it existed, well, to be honest, Pakistan never really accepted the original language and status of Kashmir to begin with. We call it occupied. So I think this notion of renewing Article 370 or bringing back Article 370, I think that's not what's important here. What's important is that there's a demonstration of some kind of concession to the Kashmiri people, not to Pakistan, because this isn't really about Pakistan. It's really about the ability of Kashmiris to live freely. And I think if there are moves in that direction, it'll create the space for the peacenik Pakistani generals and the prime minister to drive forward the process. But I don't think India is in any mood to make any concessions at all.
Okay, let's take that last point, in fact, to General Hasnain, because I think that Delhi would argue that what happens between Delhi and Srinagar will happen on its own terms and not to demonstrate anything to Pakistan. That said, Ambassador Raghavan will testify that Jammu and Kashmir has been willy-nilly on the dialogue table between India and Pakistan now for decades. It's not a recent occurrence. But as has terrorism for India, from an Indian perspective. Now, I know that before you were DOC, you were also brigade commander in Uri, and I was struck by that when Nikita was talking about how the villages in Uri and Poonch suffer, the border villages of Atari, Wagah suffer. And of course, all of that is taken. But, every time I speak to my friends from Pakistan, and I do have, as all of us do, very good friends across the border, and we find that we can't actually agree on a single thing of substance. We all want the same outcome, but we do not agree on how to get there, and we do not agree on what the obstacles are. General Hasnain, what does this do to the conversation? I mean, Ambassador Raghavan says maybe public health cooperation. I don't think Pakistan's going to recognize that vaccine as a made in India vaccine, if that's what we're looking for here.
See, Barkha, some very interesting range of questions that you have raised. But my perception that Mosharraf is quite out of sync with what's happening in Kashmir and in India-Pakistan relations at the moment, as far as Jammu and Kashmir is concerned. Firstly, when all these so-called proposals were coming from the government of Pakistan, which were coming from the Pakistan Army Chief, etc., what was most noticeable was the absence of mention of Article 370 in any of this. In all the commentaries and reviews which were taking place in the Indian media, this was what was being focused upon, that Pakistan seems to have come to terms with it. And this Sunday you find this a completely, a reverse, a complete 180 degrees turn on this issue. That is what is actually surprising me. But on the issues which have been raised by Mosharraf, my good friend, let me tell you, the internet, I was there 20 days ago and I was doing video conferencing from there. I can do video conferencing from there with you. In the next 2 days, I'm going to be there again and prove it to you how good the internet and the whole of Kashmir is, right? Leaders, except for a few maybe awkward people connected with terror, etc., here and there, there's no one at the moment who is incarcerated in any way. Demographic change. We haven't even had time to execute the laws, let me tell you. The pandemic situation, the move of the Darbar back to Jammu, etc., has all resulted in actually a virtually hung situation in many, many ways. The legal aspects have been playing out all this time, but let me tell you, there is no such thing as demographic change actually taking place compared to what's happened in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, Mosharraf, where the 10% Kashmiris are left and you have 90% Punjabi presence in those areas, right? So something is very, very different. But I'll come back to what Ambassador Raghavan had said. Is it possible to keep Jammu and Kashmir aside and possibly look at some other things? The sentiments between the two of us are so awkwardly, focused and hung up on Jammu and Kashmir that it makes it very difficult to forget this in any conversation. Public health is the thing at the moment. Economics, the whole issue is economics. Everyone is crying for a presence of the Pakistani cricket team, perhaps at the later part of the year in the T20 tournament. These are issues that we can once again come back to. We've experimented with them many times before, many times failed. But as Ambassador Raghavan says, that in this there has to be a hit and trial method, and we have to continue playing with this all the time. To focus on Jammu and Kashmir and to look at Article 370, you will always find that you will take maybe 5 steps forward, but you take 4 steps back again.
I think it's an important point, and I'm glad, General Hasnain, that you did make the point that all the mainstream leaders who were under detention are no longer under detention. I should have actually jumped in there. I was going to, but the conversation went in a different direction. But Ambassador Raghavan, I think one of the interesting points that General Hasnain made is that we have not seen a specific referencing to 370. For example, we did not see it in General Bajwa's statements. He did speak about Jammu and Kashmir, but he did not reference 370. And it is true that 370 in the end is a provision of the Indian Constitution that actually talks about Jammu and Kashmir acceding to India, which is something that Pakistan challenges. So 370 can't actually be literalized as a point by Pakistan. It would go against all of their stated positions, yet we saw it in this statement. So it's a kind of confused space, even for Pakistan, a confused position for Pakistan to take.
Well, that is exactly the point. Before August 2019, Pakistan did not give any importance to Article 370. The one state legislative assembly did not recognize was that of Jammu and Kashmir. They were quite prepared to deal with every other chief minister except that of Jammu and Kashmir. So that is why I say that these were rhetorical positions which perhaps they were forced to take post-August 2019. And the challenge really is now how to move away from that rhetorical position to a more realistic position, which is not to say that for Pakistanis, Jammu and Kashmir will not be an issue. It will be. And that is why I say that differences between India and Pakistan in that sense are foundational. But nevertheless, stated positions need not really be a barrier all the time for any forward movement.
But can I push you,
government of-
Ambassador? Can I push you on the point of mystery that none of us have been able to solve? The ceasefire agreement to most of the people seem to come out of the blue. Now, all of you have been in the trade long enough to know nothing happens out of the blue. It was clearly a work of a back channel that was open. Why did it happen? What happened suddenly that it happened?
I think the mistake was to assume, as many people did, both in India and in Pakistan, that the situation has existed in between 2016 to roughly 2020. They assumed was a new normal, that this is going to be now the permanent state of affairs. That assumption is wrong, because India-Pakistan relations have historically gone through a cycle, and no state of either relations at a very good positive level or at a very low negative level, neither state is permanent. The challenge for diplomacy always has been, how do you moderate these crests and troughs? How do you introduce more stability and try to avoid these wild swings in either direction? So like General Hasnain, I was not surprised myself when the ceasefire agreement came. I don't think we need to look for major factors. We don't need to look for back channels. The fact is that the current state of affairs was no longer in either Pakistan's interest or in India's interest. This tactical firefighting on the LOC was a totally counterproductive state of affairs for both sides. And therefore, it made sense to end that state. And I think also the realization was that we have to move beyond this 2016-2020 impasse. And one should remember that this impasse also is bookended by developments which are quite out of character with what happened between 2016 and 2020. The end of 2015 saw Prime Minister Modi's visit to Pakistan. Again, nobody was prepared for it, but some people had anticipated that something like this was on the cards. End of 2019, after August 2019, after all the legislative changes, you have a major breakthrough, which is the visa-free corridor for Kartarpur Sahib. So I think there is a fair element of complexity, and I agree entirely with Mosharraf, and I educate myself reading his columns, that this binary approach of this black and white perspective on India-Pakistan relations, no matter what your political position is too simplistic.
Yeah, I think we would all agree with that last bit, certainly, that we can't apply these sort of black and white, simple-minded binaries. I need to start taking last comments. Nikita, I just want to bring you briefly in. I was struck by a little detail reading your report, which spoke about how even in 1965, when India and Pakistan did go to war, you had several branches of Indian banks still operational in Pakistan. So, commerce has existed through some of the worst times that we have known between our nations. Yet today we are unable to separate it. And how can we from politics? So, any little nuggets like that you'd like to share?
Sure, Barkha. Actually, apart from the 1965, we saw this in 2007 also when Samjhauta blast happened. When the blast happened in February, and in August that year, the modalities to allow cross-border movement of trucks via Wagah Atari were chalked out. And in the same year, in October, the transit actually got initiated. So it's not that when the trade gets derailed, you cannot go back. It is that you need political inclination on both sides. And actually, I think I would like to bring out one point which I noticed in both Jammu and Kashmir and more specifically in Punjab, that while people are talking about replicating an India-China model where you bring trade at the forefront so that trade does not get impacted by any strain in the bilateral relationship, people at the state level do not agree with that. I had very close interactions with government of Punjab, where we have already started discussions where they're already thinking of how to insulate these border economies from cross-border economic opportunities. They are talking about stakeholders on the ground are talking about, just as an example, a rail link between Patti and Makhu, which are the two cities in Punjab. And if you establish this rail link between the two cities, that reduces the distance between Amritsar and Bombay by 250 kilometers. And similarly, it reduces the distance between Jammu and Bombay by 250 kilometers. So that actually that would open up a whole new array of economic opportunities for these traders. So while at the center level, at least people who are pro this trade, support this trade, are talking about how to create more economic interdependency, I think at the state we are starting to discuss how to insulate our border economies, because trade cannot.
And I have to say, the realist in the room, I actually don't think that's possible. It may be an idealized aspiration, but given our countries, I don't think it's possible. I also don't think that the previous India-China template, given what we've seen happen in the high mountains of the Himalayas, holds any more, Nikita, as it once used to. But it's an interesting point that border states will have a very different perspective often than those who live away from borders. Mosharraf, starting last comments with you. Sorry, Nikita, one sentence? Yeah.
Yeah, just one more point, Barkha, that actually, again, as an example of gypsum, it is not just about cross-border trade. Sometimes these things also have a strong impact on the domestic economy. And we saw that in case of gypsum, because the gypsum coming from Pakistan was going to cement plants in the eastern side of India as well as Nepal. But when this trade stopped, these trucks would ideally, before the trade stop, would carry back cotton yarn from, let's say, Uttar Pradesh to Punjab. But now when this trade stopped, the freight rate actually doubled for this truck transit between Uttar Pradesh and Punjab.
Yeah, no, there are very consequences, including on domestic prices. This is what we've been talking about. Mosharraf, a slightly different question to you, which is that there is a wide belief in India. We were talking about this before the show started, and again, the binaries may not apply, that someone like Nawaz Sharif, one of the reasons that he fell out with the army was his desire to sort of build a kind of a dramatic, lasting peace with India. There could be many other reasons, including his assertion of authority over the military. But do you share that perspective? Was that one of the reasons that Imran Khan would be far more cautious, given what happened to Nawaz Sharif?
No, I think that the current process of detente, going back all the way to the spring of 2018, is being driven by. You asked the question earlier. Where's it come from? It's come from General Bajwa. It has been driven by the back channel. Has been set up by and driven by General Bajwa. He continues to drive it. Prime Minister Khan, Prime Minister Sharif, Prime Minister Gilani, Prime Minister Raja Parvez Ashraf, Prime Minister Shaukat Aziz, Prime Minister Jamali, Prime Minister Shujat Hussain. You cannot name a prime minister in the last quarter century in Pakistan that has actively sought to make relations with India worse. So the political consensus for relations with India has been, for at least a quarter century, has been, we have to fix relations with India.
You don't think Nawaz Sharif had a different impulse than Imran Khan?
Well, look at the evidence. Nawaz Sharif came to the inauguration of Modi 1. Imran Khan invited the Indian leadership to his inauguration. And Imran Khan opened Kartarpur corridor. Imran Khan handed over the captured pilot. Imran Khan made a conciliatory speech after the Balakot attack. Imran Khan has articulated the position of Pakistan, which is, and I'll go back to this, Article 370 was never recognized to begin with. So what Pakistan is looking for, and this is not just General Bajwa or Imran Khan, again, I would ask us to get out of this binary, whether it's Nawaz Sharif, current Nawaz Sharif today, or Imran Khan, or General Bajwa, or Asif Ali Zardari, or any other mainstream leader in Pakistan or person with power. What is being asked is, can India demonstrate a regard for the people of Kashmir? I understand that there's a certain version of the truth that's acceptable in India as well. That's fine, but facts have to be facts. Yasin Malik is still in jail. Ali Galani is still in house arrest. 4G internet access is not universal in the valley. And most importantly, there are policy instruments that the Kashmiri people believe, above all, that are going to alter the demography of the valley. So if there is any kind of give on these kinds of issues, demonstrably, then I think Pakistan, which is already bent over backwards, will double down.
Okay.
But some of the onus on this has to lie with India. And now, I hope that people can take that, at face value, because that's what it is.
No, I was just going to say that just like you listed a whole series of mainstream Pakistani politicians across the spectrum that would have a certain perspective on Kashmir, I think that would be true for mainstream political parties across the spectrum in India when it comes to drafting a Pakistan policy, or when it comes to talking about terrorism, or indeed when it comes to talking about Kashmir, where a large sections of the opposition supported the abrogation of Article 370. So we are dealing with then mainstream political consensus in India versus mainstream political consensus in Pakistan. General Hasnain, when Mosharraf was listing all of these prime ministers, but before that prefaced it by saying that this back channel in a way is being run by General Bajwa, do you think instead of saying was Nawaz Sharif more of a peacenik than Imran Khan, we need to be looking more closely at the Pakistani military chiefs? This is an idea that has been proposed before and never really goes anywhere.
I tend to agree with that. This has long been felt in India that the Pakistan Army rules the roost. No major decisions at the strategic level are going to take place in Pakistan without the army's consent. So obviously then why not do business with the people who run the country? And I have no doubt that the ceasefire has come about because of a back channel, and which was probably in place, and General Bajwa has been moving this kind of a thing for quite some time. I'm aware of the kind of messaging that he has been doing to military leaders in India also, obviously, but in India the response doesn't go from the military, it goes from the political side. So to that extent, I fully agree that we should be doing business with the military, because it's not going to change in Pakistan in a hurry. Whatever level of democracy there is in Pakistan, whoever is in charge of political aspects in Pakistan, the Pakistan army, the deep state, so to say, not a very good term to use, but the deep state, so to say, will continue to run Pakistan. So why not do business with them, if at all we want to move forward? But the issue with the final note, if I may just respond to Mosharraf Zaidi also, is the fact that, with Pakistan, we have made all these so-called efforts you spoken about for the last 25 years. But these have gone hand in hand with the proxy war. For 30 years, the proxy war has gone on in the hinterland of Jammu and Kashmir. Infiltration has been on. I mean, you are sitting and denying it. So we can keep exchanging these notes each time. I mean, as far as we are concerned, the amount we have suffered in Jammu and Kashmir, in our own state, the kind of casualties that we have taken, 30 years, the state of economy which has taken place there, it's all happened because of the proxy war sponsored from the other side. So, I mean, I don't want to be a spoiler in this entire discussion, which has been a very good discussion so far. The issue still remains that if this kind of a sponsorship continues, then obviously there is no room for peace. There's no room for peace at all.
There is a problem in Kashmir that, even if one is to concede that all militancy roots itself outside India and outside occupied Kashmir, which is not the case, but even if one is to concede that, there is some ground that is being exploited. And the fact that serious Indians, I mean, I'm so personally fond of General Atta Hasnain, as I am of you, Barkha, and other friends in India. But the denial that there is a serious problem in terms of Kashmiri identity, rejecting Indian identity over the last 70 years, and that it's so easily exploitable by outside forces outside of occupied Kashmir, Indians need to think about this instead of denying it.
I'm going to give the last word to Ambassador Raghavan, but since you did interject on General Hasnain's closing comments, I'll just let him respond briefly. But when I was listening to you, General Hasnain, it isn't just Jammu and Kashmir that proxy war has made itself felt in areas outside, very much outside of Jammu and Kashmir. And how can we forget what's the fact that there have been multiple dossiers sent over on the 26/11 attacks and the city of Mumbai, which was an act of war. And so, Mosharraf, this isn't, when we talk about terrorism, in fact, we're not talking only about Jammu and Kashmir. But General Hasnain, very quickly, if you'd like to respond, and then Ambassador Raghavan can wrap this up for us.
Ideally, Barkha, I would love to forget all this, and I would like to move forward, discuss good things. I was hoping that these kind of proposals which are taking place from Pakistan at this time would actually help us to take this whole issue forward. But obviously, that's not to be because of this unfortunate turnaround. I am still very hopeful that this is only a temporary setback. I'm always, that I'm always someone who's very, very positively hopeful. I think in the coming few days, you're going to find more things building up, some more positives building up. I think there's no need for us to respond immediately. because these responses which take place to these kind of developments tend to be very tactical, and tactical responses generally don't result in anything. So I think that is the approach with which we should follow our entire process with Pakistan.
Spoken like a good soldier. Ambassador Raghavan, you and Mosharraf have agreed on one thing, that the binaries don't apply, and that in some ways India and Pakistan are almost like, that bad relationship that is accustomed to the fact that there will be good days and then there will be worse days, or there may not be any good days, but there will be bad days and there will be worse days, and we actually try and aspire at least to get to the point of bad days. Where are we right now on this spectrum, and where do you see us going from here?
Well, firstly, just on the point which Mosharraf was making earlier, I think Indians and Pakistanis will never agree on Jammu and Kashmir. As I said, it's a foundational issue for both. But that does not mean that many other things cannot happen. I don't think India and Pakistan will ever be like US and Canada. But there are other neighboring country examples around the world which are possibly more relevant for our case. But in terms of your question, I think we are on the curve has bottomed out in some senses. And I think we are now on an upward trajectory. And yes, I agree with General Hasnain that there will be temporary setbacks. But I think there is a general perception that we have to try to see that the curve remains on an upward trajectory for some time.
And why do you think we're on an upward trajectory? What gives you hope? Is it the letters exchanged by the two leaders? Is it the fact that we're even discussing trade?
I think there is a perceptible reduction in tensions because of the ceasefire coming into effect, and that makes a big difference. There is also a more positive discussion. This trade issue may have been a setback, but as Mosharraf said at the beginning, at least the question of prioritizing domestic inflation vis-a-vis import from India is being discussed rather than being a no-no altogether. I think there is a common challenge in the form of the pandemic. And if present trends continue, they would suggest that we have to really look at this much more in regional terms. And there have been certain regional efforts which in fact predate the ceasefire announcement too. And I see all of those also gathering traction in the weeks ahead.
Well, I think what we're hearing is that we need to find spaces outside of the space that we absolutely do not agree on to inch forward. I use the word inch forward. The one thing we seem to have been thankfully cured of is our subcultural need for high drama in the relationship. I think we finally got over that, because each time there was that high drama, watershed moment, etc., the joint statement dissections, we'd end up, back to square one very soon. So at least we have learned to mellow down enough to inch forward instead of looking to gallop forward. And for the moment, that and the fact that we can still in some spaces have civil disagreements is enough for me to feel a little better at the end of this program. Thank you, Mosharraf, Nikita, Ambassador Raghavan, General Hasnain. Pleasure as always. And to our audience, thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow evening, same time, same place. Thank you and goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo's Story and support independent, robust journalism.